As
part of the peace agreement between Israel and Hamas, the exchange of Israeli hostages and Palestinian detainees will finally begin tomorrow. For now, the ceasefire, the halt of bombings, and the entry of humanitarian aid are providing a brief respite for the population of Gaza. However, the so-called peace plan in no way addresses the root of the problem: the occupation of Palestinian territories by Israel with the support of the United States. Gaza also appears completely reduced to rubble after 2 years of criminal bombings. In this context, can we really call this mere truce, a pause in the genocide of the Palestinians, a peace plan?
Muy buenas noches, muy buenas tardes y muy buenos días.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. From Buenos Aires, Argentina, we begin broadcast number 277 of Demolishing Myths Talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and please remember to help us out with a thumbs up by subscribing and also through memberships. You can also follow us on our social media, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Joining us once again today from Madrid, Spain, on the other side of the screen, and the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, is our dear Fernando Moragón. Dear Fernando, how's everything over there?
Fernando Moragón. Fernando querido, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
Bien.
Well. I was going to say something. I was going to say pretty screwed, but no, I don't want to say that. I was going to say that we're here, in the middle of the continent's collapse. Europe is going to be the new Atlantis, the Atlantis of the 21st century. It's going to disappear. Anyway, yes, in the meantime, so that we're not Eurocentric and not staring at our own navel in our own decline, as you rightly point out, things are happening in the world. Lots of things. We can't keep up. This can't go on. World leaders have no consideration for us, because they could go slower, take it easy, so we'd have time to tackle all the issues. But now things just keep happening. For example, there's one case we're not going to talk about, but it would be very interesting. Come on, there are people who do know, but who knows that in Madagascar, the largest island in Africa, in the Indian Ocean, there have been about 20 days of protests, and that yesterday, part of the army joined the demonstrators going against their prime minister? Well, no one, right? Because it doesn't make the news. I get that people say, bah, Madagascar, who cares about Madagascar and all that? I don't know, the lemurs and all that. They're very interesting monkeys, prosimians and all that. But anyway, beyond that, we don't have time. We don't have time because the news piles up. And that's the problem we have. The news piles up. We'll talk about Russia, we'll talk about the Middle East, we'll talk about Afghanistan, we'll talk about a bunch of places, and we'll end up, well, not talking about Madagascar because we just don't have time.
Indeed, there are conflicts all over the world. In addition to Madagascar, another of the unfortunately ongoing conflicts today is in the Congo, as well as in several areas of the Sahel. But for today, dear Fernando, as our first topic, we want to present this. Statements made just minutes ago, literally. Behind them, the Israeli Prime Minister with these remarks.
The most popular man in the world, right?
Indeed, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed his citizens, the Israeli public, in Hebrew, naturally, saying the following: "Citizens of Israel, brothers and sisters, this is an emotional night, a night of tears, a night of joy, because tomorrow the children will return to their borders. This is a historic event that mixes the pain of releasing the murderers with the joy of the hostages' return. This is a historic event that some did not believe would happen, but our fighters believed, many in the nation believed, and I believed. I know there are many disagreements among us, but today, and I hope also in the future, we have every reason to set them aside, because together we have achieved tremendous victories, victories that astonish the entire world." These were Netanyahu's words just minutes ago. In a short time, In just a few hours, the exchange will begin. Israeli hostages held by Hamas and Palestinian detainees held by Israel. Before we begin the analysis, Fernando, let's show some images, starting with one of the few things that, if not hopeful, are at least positive, since at least the current situation, the current truce, is creating space for this, the entry of humanitarian aid, which for a very long time had been interrupted, suspended, thinned out, minimized. These are images of the arrival of humanitarian aid. According to many experts, not even this can meet the real needs of the population in Gaza. Around 600 trucks should be dispatched daily. They don't even come close to that number. But still, for a population that is bombed daily, starving and suffering, this naturally brings a small, though temporary, sense of relief. That's one side of it. I wanted to start with the most positive aspect. Now then, in the context of this situation, here we see images of the moment this aid was delivered. Pay attention to this, Fernando. This is the moment when this aid is being delivered, or rather, when the aid is arriving, to the Gazan population, truly desperate, in nightmarish images, within a context of constant danger. Because, although in general terms, the Israeli armed forces are retreating to the so-called Yellow Line, despite that, we are still witnessing attacks by both Israeli tanks and helicopters, which naturally fuels the population's despair. And logically, as the aid arrives, everyone rushes fervently to get it as quickly as possible. These images are tremendous.
Tremendas estas imágenes.
And above all, the setting. The setting is Dantesque. We don't see a single building, only a heap of ruins, that is, rubble.
Pay attention to that, Fernando Moragón.
And you can see the food.
What an image, Fernando. Truly disheartening.
Look at the scene, like I was telling you. The thing is, of course, they don't even have a shabby house, not even a shack to live in, because it's all rubble.
Imagine the sanitary or health conditions they have. But any other people in the world would have abandoned the territory in this situation. Only the Gazans, only the Palestinians, with skin so hardened after so much suffering, so many attacks, so many bombings, so much death, only they can respond with this love for their land and this level of resistance, truly living among the ruins. Pay attention to how many people, Fernando, are living there, on a devastated land, utterly devastated.
Un territorio devastado, directamente devastado.
Efectivamente, es decir, esto, pues bueno, muestra muy...
Indeed, that is to say, this, well, clearly shows what has so far been the massacre and destruction caused by Mr. Netanyahu's government. And well, quite justifiably, Mr. Netanyahu and his government, the State of Israel, are currently very unpopular among the global population because, well, these images speak for themselves.
Estas imágenes lo dicen todo.
Aquí, Fernando, otra vez imágenes.
Here, Fernando, once again, images. If not positive, at least a little less terrible. These show the preparation of vehicles for the transport of Palestinian prisoners and detainees soon to be released. I don't recall the exact number, whether 150 or 250, all of them captured after October 7th, and among those released or soon to be exchanged, a large number of women and children. And now, Fernando, regarding your recent comment about the level of destruction, here are some of the images also obtained in the last few hours, after the withdrawal of Israeli troops and the possibility of leaving hiding places and starting a sweep, in a way, with a drone, to fly over Gaza. Pay attention to these images, Fernando.
Let's see.
podemos presenciar esto.
We can witness this thanks to the interruption, at least temporary, of the ongoing bombings, right? That's why we have these images.
Efectivamente, al dejar entrar
Indeed, by allowing organizations or individuals with aid to enter, you can launch a drone, a small one with a camera that lets you capture those kinds of shots. And while right now, Israel is not interested for the moment in creating or continuing with the disaster. But anyway, the images, as I was saying, the other day I read somewhere about the level of destruction. And for example, if we compare it with Berlin, Hamburg, or Dresden, with the Western bombings in World War II and so on, the level of destruction in Gaza surpasses all of those by far.
de Gaza supera a de todos estos, pero con diferencia. Por poner así ejemplos históricos, ¿no? Es decir,
To give some historical examples, right? I mean, as you can see, you might find a building that's still habitable, but everything else is flat. I mean, there's a chair left, maybe a building that's more or less kept its basic structure but completely destroyed. And then the rest, well, there it is. I mean, the streets.
Imágenes apocalípticas, Fernando.
Apocalyptic images, Fernando, like something out of a science fiction movie about a post-nuclear apocalypse, right?
All that's missing, well, is adding zombies. I mean it, really, like you say, well, there's a person.
There, a person. Did you see that detail up there on the right?
Yes, with a broom, trying to make the place somewhat habitable, that is, sweeping up the dust and debris, and trying to make a room that has no walls at least have a roof.
Tremendous, right? Well, aside from the security issue.
But look, if they were clear about this, if the Israelis, the government of Israel, were clear about this, look how clear they were that when the attack on Gaza began 2 years ago, one of the things they already had very clear was that they had to maintain a certain order, certain coordinated capabilities to destroy Gaza, to bomb Gaza, to prevent. They already knew what they were going to do. That those huge piles of rubble that would form shouldn't become so large that they would block the passage of the Israeli ground forces themselves. In other words, from the very beginning, they already knew that the level of destruction they were going to cause would be total, brutal, and that in order to keep killing people, they had to preserve certain lines, certain roads, or the few paths through which the ground forces could enter. And then they tell us that this wasn't planned, that it wasn't thought out, that these were just events that happened one after another. Not at all.
The images of the children returning with their little school backpacks are truly heartbreaking.
And the images we can show and the ones we can't show are, well, enough to make you cry. Literally. I mean, to the point of tears.
Here are some testimonies. The first young man says, "I hope all Arab countries support us, since what's happening is very wrong." Another man comments that it's an immense hardship, that Gaza has been at war for 2 years, with the resulting famine and destruction. Well, yes, almost. No, it's just that. We'll double the testimonies, because the images already portray the situation in a heartbreaking way.
There's a mother with a baby. Yes, I mean, there are people who, in families that tend to be large, have many children. Then the parents, the mothers, have brothers, sisters, and so on. They're extended families, very large, right? And there were testimonies, I'm not even talking about now, but in the first months, constant testimonies from people saying, I remember one in particular, a Palestinian, who said to a man, I don't know, a young man, but he said to his father, "Don't die, don't die." They were carrying him on a stretcher. "Don't die, because I have no one left in my family." That is, his brothers, his children, his grandparents, all had been wiped out, so to speak, that is, massacred. It's terrible. "Don't die, father, you're the last one I have left. They killed my mother, they killed my brothers, they killed my nephews, they killed my children, they killed my wife. There's no one else left for me."
matado a mis hijos, que ha matado a mi mujer, que no me queda nadie más.
Fernando,
Esta es la realidad.
¿qué tal? Sí.
Fernando, a few questions to start the actual analysis. We need to show the images because of the need for dissemination. And that's why, by the way, we make an earnest request for your help by sharing, giving a thumbs up, commenting. Every interaction with the platform helps spread this, which, by the way, is censored almost everywhere. Very few channels show images like these. That said, Fernando, how about we start analyzing the situation regarding the sustainability of this so-called peace plan, in quotes, or rather this truce, this ceasefire. And maybe we could also discuss why now and not before. 2 years ago, during the first hostage exchange, if I remember correctly, about a month after October 7th, 2023, with the exchange of 150 hostages, the vast majority of those captured by Hamas at the time. Why now and not then?
Because the goals have never been the ones Israel proclaims. They're different. That is, Netanyahu has never been interested in this. Now he's had no other choice, among other things, because over time, the pressure in the streets has been tremendous, in the Israeli streets, for the return of the hostages, against him, specifically against his government. To the point, I don't know if you have the Wyckoff video, well, we'll show it later. I won't spoil it, we'll show it later. But notice that, unfortunately,
We'll present it while you do your analysis.
Notice that, unfortunately, Netanyahu has already done part of the analysis work for us. Well, it's very interesting, because now Wyckoff says something or other. Pay attention.
So just to give some context, in a bit, the booing at Eastern, the demonstration in favor of the exchange, led by Steve Wyckoff and Jared Kushner. What's the relationship? Son-in-law, right?
The son-in-law, yes, the daughter's husband.
Ivanka Trump's husband, both of them in Israel, to finalize the deal. 2 days ago, if I'm not mistaken, they held or took part in an event attended by many Israelis. And amid the cheers and shouts of support from the crowd, at one point, if I remember correctly, Wyckoff makes a reference to Netanyahu. Now, if I'm not mistaken, a little later on.
Say the cursed name. Look here, they're holding photos of the hostages, with Israeli flags, with American flags, nothing suspicious, in other words. These are Israelis who couldn't care less about Gaza, that's just how it is. About the Palestinians. But, and here's the catch, they're anti-Netanyahu.
With the help of Donald Trump's leadership, those words right there. And if I remember correctly, the mention of Netanyahu comes up next. Just a bit more. Now, this was achieved thanks to the work of world leaders who strive for peace. One of them is here with me, Jared Kushner. Since when is Kushner a political leader? I don't remember that, but anyway. There you go.
He said Netanyahu and you can hear the booing.
Prime Minister Netanyahu took part in the negotiations. And there's the audience's reaction.
Unequivocal, and he mentions Netanyahu again. And they boo him again.
Once again, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and a total and absolute rejection from the Israelis themselves.
From the Israelis.
From the Israelis.
Let's make this very clear. The vast majority of the Israeli population is against Netanyahu, because they know perfectly well that Netanyahu has done absolutely nothing for the release of the hostages. That's why they boo him. Another thing is that, under the pressure of the Israeli population that wanted the exchange between prisoners and the release of the hostages to happen, well, he's had to more or less swallow it. That is, in the end, after 2 years. after 2 years. Because for him that was a card that allowed him to justify the war in Gaza. No, I have to free the hostages, when he had no intention of doing so. And he's done everything possible to prevent their release. It's not just that he had no intention. He's done everything possible and impossible to make sure it didn't happen. And the Israeli population knows this. And this is the reason why Netanyahu clings to power no matter what, because he knows that the moment he stops being prime minister, he'll lose the elections and go to jail. Just like that. Because the people of Israel want him in jail, and because he has a bunch of pending trials. Look at what I said before. Netanyahu has already done part of the work for us. The analysis, in that speech of his you mentioned, the one he gave today. He also said the following, in case there was any doubt about Netanyahu's intentions, about his pacifist nature. I don't know how they're not talking about the Nobel Peace Prize, instead of the Mikado Hill, while they're at it, given how discredited it is. Well, might as well go all in and give it to the most undeserving one.
Perdidos al río se lo das al mar desgraciado. Pero bueno, pues ha dicho lo siguiente, leo textualmente.
Anyway, he said the following. I'll read it verbatim. Pay attention. I want to tell you, wherever we fight, we win. But at the same time, I must tell you, the campaign is not over. The campaign is not over. And he goes on to say, there are still very significant security challenges ahead. Some of our enemies are trying to regroup to attack us again. And, as we say, we're on it. So basically, they're at war. I mean, it couldn't be clearer.
Están en guerra. O sea, más claro no se puede decir. Esto no ha acabado, esto es una tregua.
This isn't over. This is a truce. Now they'll devote themselves, as they did a couple of days ago, to bombing Hezbollah in Lebanon for a while, just because they feel like it, without any provocation. In other words, they're getting ready for unity. I have nothing more to say. There's no clearer way to put it. I want to tell you, wherever we fight, we win, but at the same time I must also tell you the campaign isn't over. The war isn't over. Couldn't be clearer. I mean, what are their intentions? Because, as we said before, the moment the war ends, the man goes to jail. And the next piece of news, one of the latest I've been able to see, is the following. Benjamin Netanyahu is, what a surprise, trying to postpone his next court hearing on Wednesday. This Wednesday, next week, he has a new court hearing with his lawyers citing a critical and urgent, he's running out of excuses, undisclosed diplomatic visit. So it's a critical and urgent diplomatic visit, but we don't know who's coming, and a sudden meeting with Cypriot President Nikos Christodoulidis. In other words, the man can no longer say, no, I'm at war in Gaza, I'm at war with... No, right now, at this very moment, you're not at war with anyone. And so, well, he makes up something else. Let's see, I've lost count if this is the 9th or 10th time he's had one of these postponements. It's because of his corruption trials. So of course, Netanyahu is cornered from a judicial standpoint. The only thing that allows him to save himself is being in a permanent state of war, or in a permanent war. And now, fine, we set aside the issue of Gaza for a while, let them return the hostages, who are no longer that important from the perspective of continuing my war, when it's already clear to him and his army has told him and his generals and his general staff that this has no solution, that they've already invaded Gaza several times and haven't been able to eliminate Hamas, and that even if they invade it once more, they still won't be able to eliminate Hamas. Not by doing this, nor by destroying everything, can they eliminate Hamas. So well, as you already know and all that, he said, well, let's give Trump a little gift. And on the other hand, he's already getting ready for the next military campaigns. We've already seen how he's been, as I said yesterday and the day before and so on, in Lebanon, but bombing heavily. He keeps sending bombers from time to time in Syria and getting ready for war against Iran, for the second part of the war against Iran. And when that's over, he'll probably go back again. The agreements will be scrapped and he'll turn against Gaza. That is to say, as you rightly point out, this is a truce, a temporary pause.
Y Fernando, ¿por qué ahora? ¿Cuál tu interpretación? ¿Por qué ahora?
Why now? What's your interpretation? Why now? Why not before? Why not later? By the way, we're showing the images of the destruction along with one of the few videos released yesterday, an aerial shot taken with a drone.
Yes, yes. Let's see, I think there are several causes, that is, the elements or factors. One of them is the one we've mentioned, the pressure from the Israeli population, which is tired of being fooled about the hostage issue by the current government. Second, Trump's own pressures, which, well, are already a bit of a joke. With his famous attempt to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and the fact that he knows they have to move on to a second phase of the war against Iran together with the Israelis. He's told Netanyahu, look, this isn't compatible. I mean, if we're going after Iran, the issue of Gaza, the issue of Hamas, given Israel's current unpopularity and so on, after the recognitions, even if they're recognitions that are practically useless, but still in terms of propaganda and all that, recognitions at the United Nations, etc. Look, if we want to go that route against Iran, demonizing Iran, then we have to pause for a while with the Gaza issue. Then you can continue later. That is, right now we have to stop. And also incidents like that of the famous flotilla, the detention, the fact that participants in several of those flotillas have returned and in their respective countries have told how badly they were treated, that they were tortured, and so on. Well, that's obviously very negative publicity because it spreads everywhere. And in the end, as I said, it's also a problem of incapacity, in other words, of defeat. Even if they tell us they're winning, that they've won, and so on, no, they've lost. That is, they don't see a way out, from a military point of view, of the confrontation with Hamas in Gaza. They don't have one. So, since they don't see a way out, they've had to take this pause to rethink things, to rethink the war, not peace. I mean, to try to find some kind of military solution, or what they initially intended, that is, ethnic cleansing. But of course, ethnic cleansing has no solution. It's like squaring the circle. Because the only place where the Palestinians could be expelled to is Egypt, through the Sinai Desert, across Gaza's shared border with Egypt. And that's it. And that's impossible. Egypt is not going to allow it, no matter if Trump pressures them or if Martians do, because it would mean the end of the current regime. As we've explained many times, they simply won't do it. From the beginning, look, since we first started talking about this, we already said this is a war that cannot be won. It's like Ukraine, even though the scenarios and situations are completely different. But these are wars you've already lost from the start because you can't achieve the goals you've set. It's impossible. So, well, they've tried everything. That is to say, they've tried to wipe out Hamas and they couldn't. They've tried ethnic cleansing and they couldn't. They've tried elimination, since the word is forbidden, the elimination of the Palestinian population as much as possible. And they can't do that either because it's not that easy. I mean, there are, or were, more than 2 million inhabitants in Gaza. So, in the end, they've reached a stalemate that makes Netanyahu shift. And I think now he's redirecting his warlike intentions elsewhere. Let's not forget he's at war with 7 states. The Houthis have said that, although they don't agree, they're going to stop the attacks against Israel, so it can't be said that they're an excuse for Mr. Netanyahu in order to facilitate this process. Iran has said the same thing, even though they don't agree either. They've said, no, we're not going to do anything, we're going to facilitate this process. We're not going to give the Israelis any excuses. and while they find themselves having to rethink their US-Israeli war strategy in the Middle East. But anyway, as I said, we'll see about the aggression against Iran. The Iranians are getting ready. It's true, and this is a factor we'll have to take into account. It's very important, even if it's not very flashy, even if he hasn't made big statements like the Westerners do, like Trump and company. But President Putin has already told Netanyahu, he had a phone conversation with him a few days ago, he's already told Netanyahu, Trump, and all of them, and he's hinted at something very diplomatically. Well, first he said he supports Mr. Trump's peace plan, but the peace plan only if it's fully implemented, of course, not just the part that suits them. Second, he said, or rather hinted, that things can't go on like this. In other words, a solution must be found. Not only regarding the Palestinian issue, but also the conflicts in the Middle East. And then he backed it up with actions, which is also important. And there's the fact that, for the moment, there's been a certain slowdown in the military actions or intentions of Americans and Israelis against Iran. The thing is, they've started supplying Iran with large quantities of weapons and key weapons at that. And that's already backing it up with actions. In other words, the Iranians have protested, so to speak, in quotes. Netanyahu has protested to Putin for sending weapons to Iran. And of course, I send weapons to whoever I want, obviously, especially to a country with which I have an agreement.
On that point, Fernando, to recap your words, the fact that this truce is beginning now, that it began a few days ago, is due to both internal and external factors. Among the internal factors are the economic crisis in Israel, the military crisis resulting from the number of casualties and the shortage of soldiers, basically, and the political crisis caused by the growing demand from Israeli society, from the Israeli electorate, for an exchange and the release of the hostages. That's from the internal political side. And from the external side, in your analysis, you mentioned 2 or 3 causes, if I remember correctly. On one hand, the shift in international public opinion, the Sumut flotilla, if I'm remembering the name correctly, as one of its expressions. On the other hand, the search for some breathing room to begin the second round, the second part of the war against Iran, the search for room to take on Iran militarily. And finally, Trump's pressure. Those are the 3 external factors, generally speaking.
Basically, and notice that I'm already saying this, so they don't forget they're still at war, that's why I mentioned it. When the peace agreement had already been implemented and approved by all parties, they kept bombing Lebanon, Syria. They kept pounding away. In other words, this is a pause, a truce, while a weakened Israel and a weakened Israeli government together with the United States, because let's not forget that in the end, Israel can't do anything without the United States. Regroup. They're being supplied with weapons. That's another issue too. They have to keep supplying them with weapons.
Well, this is within the military crisis. There's not only a shortage of soldiers, but also of weapons, both those produced in Israel and those coming from the United States, which are scarce due to the delivery of ground weapons to both Israel and Ukraine. Now, can I add something to support your argument about Trump's pressure? Why did Trump decide to apply more pressure now than in the past? For me, Fernando, he appears as a key element in this shift, in this change. Sorry, my phone alarm. In this shift, in the change of mood, in a way, among Trumpist voters, among the MAGA base. For several months now, it's not only Democratic voters in the United States who support the Palestinian cause, or at least reject the genocide, but also, at least since the assassination of Charlie Kirk, or even before, a significant part of the Trumpist MAGA electoral base, and of course, numerous media figures of the Make America Great Again movement, such as Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, or Charlie Kirk himself, before his assassination. According to many MAGA followers, carried out by Israel, whether that's true or not, is irrelevant here. The important thing is the conviction of MAGA members, of MAGA followers, about this. Well, this has led to a change in the Trumpist electorate's perception of Israel and Palestine. From blindly supporting the massacres, the genocide, and any atrocity, they now suddenly take a very critical stance toward Israel. Lately, Tucker Carlson has been firing heavy ammunition at Israel, not so much because of the genocide, but supposedly because of the capture of US foreign policy by the Israeli lobby. And this is creating a lot of pressure on Trump. And at the same time, Trump logically passes that pressure on to Netanyahu. If I'm in trouble with my electorate, then you're in trouble with me. This is, to me, a very important element within your analysis as well, Fernando, regarding the reason behind Trump's pressure, an undoubtedly significant factor.
What you were pointing out, that is, that very, very popular figures, especially within MAGA like Tucker Carlson, are firing heavy ammunition, meaning criticizing Israel. What you were saying, why is my country's foreign policy hijacked by a state whose representatives, let's say official or unofficial, well, in a certain sense official because lobbies are legally recognized there, like the, what's the name of that association?
AIPAC.
AIPAC. I mean, well, how is it possible, or to what extent can we tolerate that an association that is a foreign lobby can determine U.S. foreign policy? And all those kinds of things that Tucker Carlson and others are putting out are doing a lot of harm. Besides, they're very popular there. Let's not forget that Tucker Carlson, before going independent, when he was fired from Fox, was Fox's star host for many years. So he's someone who has a lot of pull among Republicans within the Republican electorate. This means that, in the end, there's an internal movement that's hard to gauge among people who have influence, and some who have more than just influence. Let's not forget that Tucker Carlson is someone who personally knows Trump, meaning he was, in quotes, a buddy of his. So we're not talking about, no, what I mean is, well, these are people, let's say, with access to the White House. This doesn't necessarily mean they're listened to or not, but they do have access to the White House and therefore influence. And what we're seeing is how a sector of the media political class is beginning to question and at least try to push the Jewish lobby in the United States toward a certain marginalization, considering it harmful to American interests.
Considerándolo como perjudicial para los intereses norteamericanos. Y esto está increciendo, veremos hasta dónde llega, no sabemos hasta dónde llega.
And this is on the rise. We'll see how far it goes. We don't know how far it will go. But what we're seeing, as you mentioned, Candace Show, whatever it's called, they're already saying that Charlie Keegan was killed by the Mossad, rightly or wrongly. In other words, whether it's true or not, they're already claiming, no less, that the secret services of a foreign country are killing people who hadn't done anything, people they wanted to take down, even those who were friends of Israel, and that for having made some criticism in their final moments of certain well-known messages, in Charlie Keegan's case, supposedly tweets and such, in which he complained about Israel's stance and what it was doing in the 48 hours before he was killed. Well, this is leading at least one sector of the media political class to question whether the Israeli lobby really has the influence and power it holds in the United States.
Here, images from Lebanon, from the attacks carried out the day before yesterday, if I remember correctly. Indeed, once again, despite the existing truce between Israel and Lebanon, once again broken by Israel. And if I'm not mistaken, in that truce, by the way, in that so-called peace agreement, in that ceasefire, France was or is participating as a guarantor, not only the United States, which validates any kind of violation by Israel. In this case, France as well. I honestly don't recall many outraged reactions from Macron or French leaders about this. They silently validate it, nothing more.
Well, the French have enough on their plate with Le Cornu's second attempt, or Le Cornua, however you say it, that is, trying to form a government and pass a budget. Because Macron, after the failure and Le Cornu's resignation, said, "I'll repeat the nonsense, I'm going to propose him again as prime minister." So, there's that Einstein quote that's been all over memes lately, and applying it to Macron. Well, Einstein basically said, I don't understand why people, in this case, politicians, do exactly the same thing 18 times and expect that on the 19th the result will be different. It makes no sense. I mean, well, I don't know what Mr. Macron expects, that by doing exactly the same thing, that is, appointing the same people again over and over, things are somehow going to be different when he doesn't have a parliamentary majority. Well, this is Macron trying to escape France's massive internal problems by doing these things. No, I'll act as a guarantor in Syria. But what do you mean act as a guarantor? Well, yes, in Lebanon. In Lebanon. You can't even act as a guarantor in your own country. You can't guarantee a government in your own country. What are you going to guarantee in Syria? Well, in Lebanon. Nowhere. The thing with Macron is really, well, unbelievable. But anyway, we're seeing it happen. Just think about it. Right now we have Hezbollah and the Shiites in Lebanon, let's say more or less at odds with the current government, the current president of Lebanon, who is a Maronite Christian, and they've reached an agreement with Israel and the United States, mainly with the United States, to take charge of Lebanon's military control. And therefore, Hezbollah would no longer have the military power it currently holds in Lebanon. All of this is going nowhere. I mean, the Lebanese army isn't going to confront Hezbollah, not even drunk. But anyway, they had agreed to this and so on. And after this bombing, with no justification whatsoever, even the president himself, if only rhetorically, has had to protest against these unjustifiable and absolutely, well, even the so-called supporters of the United States and Israel have had to protest, if only to avoid Lebanese public opinion turning against them over this kind of bombing. There's absolutely no justification or reason for it, because Hezbollah is strictly complying.
Before wrapping up this topic, the first one in this conversation, Fernando, I want to present something without the confirmation of our own analyses, without the certainties of our own perspectives. A suspicion, hopefully mistaken, about the reason for this moment, the reason for this truce right now. And I want to present it based on a British publication, The Guardian no less. This one here, the Spanish translation over here. Well, the former Israeli intelligence chief said that 50 Palestinians must die for each victim of October 7th. It doesn't matter if they are children, said Aharon Jalaba in recorded comments, calling the death toll necessary.
Calificando el número de muertos de necesario. Esta la cara de Aharon Jalaba.
This is the face of Aharon Jalaba, the monster responsible for these words, former head of military intelligence, who left his post in April 2004. The Israeli general who led military intelligence on October 7, 2023, said that 50 Palestinians must die for every person killed that day, and that it no longer matters if they are children, according to recordings broadcast by Israel's Channel 12 television. Why do I present this as a suspicion regarding the timing of Netanyahu's decision? Because this issue of 50 Palestinians killed for every Israeli killed, according to many sources, came up in discussions among the Israeli leadership. The intelligence services deliberated on it openly. And by the way, if we do the math, Fernando, the attacks of October 7, 2023, resulted in around 1,200 deaths. A little less than that, but rounding up. that's about it.
Un poquito menos de eso, pero redondeando eso. Si a partir de esa cifra comenzamos con el...
If we start from that figure and calculate 50 for each of them, we reach roughly 64,000 dead, based on the ratio of 50 Palestinians killed for every Israeli killed. That's the exact number of officially confirmed estimates of Palestinians killed as a result of the bombing over 2 years. Obviously, the real number is much higher. Some sources even mention figures in the hundreds of thousands, with one as high as 700,000. But, specifically, the confirmed deaths so far, right, amount to around 65,000 or 70,000, exactly matching this atrocity of 50 for each one. I present this as a suspicion, as a sting to everyone's conscience, so that each person can reflect on the possibility of this. Now, the idea of revenge.
Ahora,
la idea de venganza. Claro, la idea de venganza. Es decir, pues,
of course, the idea of revenge, I mean, 50 for one, like, well, we more or less kill the equivalent of... That idea of revenge, as I said, in an operation, the one first carried out by Hamas and then the counterattack, let's say, by the Israelis, in which there are growing suspicions. There were already many, but a few days ago a video was published, if I remember correctly, of an Israeli soldier who was telling an audience, I think right there in Israel, in Parliament or something like that, that coincidentally, on that very day, his unit was supposed to be guarding the border between Gaza and Israel. And they were told no, not that day, that they didn't need to be there, that they should go somewhere else.
Que ese día no habían, porque no tenían por qué estar allí, que fueran a otro lado. Bueno, un testimonio más, ¿eh?
Well, one more testimony, huh? We already have quite a few of these, plenty, almost from the beginning. Everything suggests that this was, let's say, a tolerated movement to use it as their own 9/11. Let's not forget what Naomi Klein mentions about the shock doctrine. That is some kind of event, whatever it may be, that shocks your population and allows you to do whatever you want. September 11 would be a paradigmatic case, right? The September 11th attack allowed Bush to obtain exceptional wartime powers and implement a policy that had already been designed before the attacks of September 11.
Que estaba hecha de antemano a los atentados del 11 de septiembre. Es decir, bueno, pues esto sería algo igual.
That is to say, well, this would be something similar, which means they either turned a blind eye or directly contributed to making it happen. Exactly. But everything points to, because, as I said, we're not talking about testimonies from one person or two or three. There are already many that have been gathered over these 2 years. And what's truly unbelievable is that in such a tiny place, the most powerful army in the region, with what are probably the most powerful secret services in the world, even more so than the CIA, didn't find out about anything. Of course, that's something nobody believes. That is to say, the Shin Bet, which is the domestic intelligence service, let's say, the Mossad is the one that carries out operations abroad. But, well, that they didn't know anything. I mean, not even a 5-year-old would believe that. So since they must have known, there are two possibilities. Either they turned a blind eye, knew what was being planned, and found it convenient for it to happen, which would be a criminal act against their own people, because they're allowing their citizens to be killed in order to justify their policy on Palestine and the Gaza territory. Or even worse, they contributed to it. That is, I'm not saying that Hamas was only financed, but that it was created and has been deeply infiltrated by Israeli intelligence services. That is to say, you directly contributed to Hamas carrying this out by allowing them to arm themselves, by allowing Qatar's funding, by allowing, well, we already know about Qatar's funding. In other words, by allowing many things, even designing the operation. This is what we can, let's say, question, whether they merely turned a blind eye or participated directly, well, rather indirectly, but by arming and developing the entire plan to provoke that September 11th, to provoke that event that would create a shock and justify Netanyahu and his government in doing what they had to do. That is, what they had already planned in advance.
Fernando, ¿qué tal si redondeamos?
Fernando, how about we wrap up this topic here and start with the next topic of this broadcast? By the way, whenever we bring up the issue of Gaza, the issue of genocide at the hands of Israel, immediately, if the number of online followers doesn't drop, suddenly an impenetrable glass barrier appears. What do they call it again? The glass barrier, right? Always.
Barrera de cristal, ¿sí? Siempre. Así que a los semoledores y a las semoledoras, ayúdennos con la difusión.
So, to all the semoladors and semoladoras, help us spread the word. Give it a thumbs up, click like, share this, because the algorithm openly reacts against it. It immediately does everything possible to at least not maximize the reach of these analyses. That said, Fernando, how about we start discussing the second topic planned for tonight with this first map? This one isn't yours, Fernando, but we'll show your two maps in a moment. This is a map of Pakistan's attacks on Afghanistan that took place 2 days ago, last Friday. Where should we begin the analysis, Fernando?
¿Por dónde comenzamos el análisis, Fernando?
Pues vamos a comenzar con un pequeño...
Well, let's start with a short introduction. Brief, really, I promise, about why these attacks are happening now. Because clashes between Pakistan and Afghanistan in the border area have always existed. From time to time there have been skirmishes. But why is this no longer just simple clashes, but something more serious? Well, this begins... Well, it goes way back, but we're not going to go too far back. Not to the prehistory of humanity, nor to the prehistory of the Taliban, or anything like that. This is part of the Great Game, that is the new Great Game in Asia or Eurasia, involving China, Russia, the United States, Europe, and so on. And specifically, it has to do with the sides that support or oppose the current Taliban government. Let's not forget, and this is important, there are two Talibans, or two Taliban groups. The one that governs Afghanistan, the Afghan Taliban, and then the Pakistani Taliban, who are more or less the same, but as we're told, they're from Pakistan. And what they want is to achieve something similar to what the Taliban have achieved in Afghanistan. Well, the majority, almost all of them, although now there's a bit more diversity, but the majority of the Taliban were originally all Pashtuns. And Pakistan and Afghanistan share that ethnicity. In fact, most Pashtuns don't live in Afghanistan, they live in Pakistan. And yet, the Pashtuns are the dominant ethnic group, the one with the largest population, the majority, in Afghanistan. There has always been a fear on Pakistan's part that the Pashtun claim would end up in the creation of a Pashtunistan, which would take a piece of Afghanistan, basically half of Pakistan. Well, that said, generally speaking, the trouble starts because during the war against Afghanistan, Pakistan sides with the United States. At that time, Pakistan is on the side of the United States, although it has its own political agenda, which doesn't always align with that of the US. After the assassination of Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, as you'll all remember, Pakistan starts to shift and eventually aligns itself with the Chinese. The Chinese, starting in 2013 when Xi Jinping announced it, launched their Belt and Road Initiative. And as we've mentioned many times, one of its key elements is what's called the China-Pakistan Corridor, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So Pakistan aligns itself with the Chinese. In fact, it's China's main ally in the region, because let's not forget that Pakistan and India are historical enemies. Since the two states emerged, since British imperialism granted independence to what had been the British Raj, Pakistan and India came into being, and they fought several wars against each other. So there's a constant and ongoing confrontation, as we always see, between India and Pakistan. That's the general picture.
Bien, ese es el mapa general. ¿Quién manda en Pakistán?
Who rules in Pakistan? It has always been ruled, or almost always been ruled, even when there are sometimes civilian governments more or less democratically elected. It has always been ruled, when it wasn't a direct dictatorship, by the military, the general staff. And within the military, those who held the most power were the military intelligence services, the inter-services intelligence. Well, there came a time when the situation in Pakistan was terrible. Cases of corruption, the usual ones, and so on. The government fell, elections were held, and they were won by a figure, let's say, not well known in the West, Imran Khan.
No suficientemente conocido en Occidente, que es Imran. Imran es un antiguo jugador de cricket.
Imran Khan is a former cricket player. He was an idol, something like the Ronaldo or Messi of cricket, to give you an idea. At the time, this man was very popular in Pakistan, a man who had already become wealthy, meaning he had no economic ambitions or anything like that. He was very famous. In fact, he was the captain of the national cricket team, and thanks to him, along with his team, it was the only time Pakistan became world champion. He's an idol in Pakistan. Imagine a Messi in Pakistan, and this man enters politics, creates a movement, a party, and wins, and he becomes prime minister, and he fights corruption. But he has a very serious flaw, and it's that he's getting close not only to China, but also to Russia. Ah, my friend. And the Americans don't like that one bit. So what do the Americans do? Together with the Pakistani military and the opposition, they prepare a soft coup in Pakistan. They depose the Prime Minister Imran Khan, throw him in jail. He's still in jail, but he continues to wield great influence because his supporters even govern in the tribal areas, that is, in the Khyber region, the old Khyber Pass and all that area. In local elections, it's Imran Khan's party that wins and governs.
Elecciones locales es el partido de Imran el que gana y el que gobierna. ¿Y qué es lo que Imran, entre las muchas cosas que proponía, aparte de la cercanía?
And what was it that Imran Khan, among the many things he proposed, aside from reaching out to the Russians, also suggested? To enter into talks with the Pakistani Taliban and with the tribal leaders who support them, the Pashtuns within Pakistan, in order to reach an agreement that would lead to disarmament and pacification of the region. A region where the Pakistani army has been fighting the Pakistani Taliban and several other groups for a very long time. This doesn't sit well because those kinds of conflicts also justify the role of the Pakistani army.
Fernando, sorry for the interruption. These images were taken minutes after the clashes, specifically of the anti-air defenses, the Taliban facing Pakistani attacks with F-16 fighters. 5 Pakistani soldiers were killed in the course of these confrontations. Throughout your explanation, we're going to show a good number of images. By the way, all of them come from the Wars and Geopolitics channel, a friendly Telegram channel. One of the best in Spanish, if not the best. Everyone's invited, myself included, to subscribe to that channel, by the way, from our friends at Wars and Geopolitics.
I use it a lot, and what's great about it is that it publishes a lot of news, so you can spend the whole day reading short pieces and get more or less a general sense of what's happening in the world. So it's highly recommended. As I said, I use it a lot. And well, so we have that framework, right? We have, therefore, a Pakistan that is favorable to the Chinese because they're investing money, because they're selling them weapons, because they're doing everything. It's the strategic ally. Let's not forget that India, at the same time, is China's historical enemy. And so we have that configuration. The Chinese support the Pakistanis. The Indians were supported by the United States and by Israel. Putting it very simply, the situation is more complex, but anyway. So what happens? As I said, Imran Khan wants to put an end to this, meaning this kind of problem. He moves closer to Russia, wants to end the Pakistani Taliban insurgency, makes some progress, then he's overthrown, and from there the new government under Sharif, who is the prime minister, quickly moves closer to the United States. When Imran Khan is overthrown, it's in 2022, that is, when the special military operation in Russia had already begun. Just so you can see how disconnected these events are.
En Rusia, para que veáis cómo están conectados los acontecimientos. Y justo después de que había hecho una visita Imran Khan a Moscú.
And right after Henry Ham had paid a visit, Master Hu had been meeting with Putin, and upon his return shortly afterward, he was deposed in Parliament in a crooked way, and as I said, ended up behind bars. So what do we have? That rapprochement with a coup by the Americans, the Anglos, begins to make Pakistan shift course. Next step, an attack, which you'll all remember, an attack that took place in Kashmir, somewhat strange. Everything points to the British and the Americans as the ones behind it. It caused the deaths of several civilians in Kashmir and so on, and triggered that border war that year between Pakistan and India.
Fronteriza que hubo este año entre Pakistán y India. Una escalada muy peligrosa que podía habernos llevado a una guerra nuclear, no olvidemos.
A very dangerous escalation that could have led to a nuclear war. Let's not forget, India and Pakistan are nuclear powers, so we already have the framework of tension. What happens from that point on? That the Pakistanis, despite the success they have with Chinese support and all that, over the Indians and so on, keep turning toward the United States, keep readjusting themselves. Why? Because let's not forget that Afghanistan right now is supported, the Taliban in Afghanistan are supported by the Russians, by the Chinese. And now comes the interesting part. They had been in talks for a long time, imagine that, with the Indians. And what happens right before these border clashes break out? And that goes far beyond simple border clashes. Well, for the first time, a legal representative of the Taliban, specifically the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Amir Khan Muttaqi, I'm probably mispronouncing it since Pashto and Dari aren't my strong suit, but anyway, visits India. And during that visit, among other things, India raises the level of its representation in Kabul to that of an embassy. It also commits to making more investments because, let's not forget, if we look at a map, we see here's India, here's Pakistan, and here's Afghanistan. It's like a sandwich, meaning Pakistan ends up between India and Afghanistan. And moreover, all the routes being developed, both Chinese and Russian, that pass through Iran, have India as their final destination. Among those branches, some go toward that hub, and others, as we can see here, toward Afghanistan. Afghanistan is fundamental in the logistical land routes. If you have a chaotic Afghanistan, or one aligned with Pakistan, Pakistan would control the whole setup. Hence its problems with the current Taliban who are governing in Afghanistan. India's rapprochement with the Taliban is pushing Pakistan to definitively side with the Americans. And in fact, during the United Nations General Assembly, the Pakistani Prime Minister, Sharif, arrived there and offered Trump, let's not forget, a solution to the United States' shortage of rare earth elements. He offers them that the rare earths they have and have discovered and so on, that they set up joint companies for their exploitation to try to mitigate the counterblow against the sanctions, or rather, the tariffs, that the Americans impose on the Chinese counterblow being the non-sale of rare earths to the United States. In other words, right now the Chinese have Donald Trump by the soft spots, because they are the world's #1 producer and #1 refiner, accounting for 70% of global exports and 90% of rare earth processing, which are essential for everything. For everything. Among them, almost all sophisticated military technology weaponry. From planes to ships to tanks, there's nothing that doesn't require rare earths. As a result, the United States is currently desperate about that issue. Well, the Pakistanis are offering them that, just before India's move to accept that historic first visit from the Afghan foreign minister to strengthen their relations, which obviously go against Pakistan's interests. In other words, a complete realignment, as we can see here.
reacomodamiento completo, aquí lo podemos ver. Fijaros.
Esto, Fernando, aquí, efectivamente, aquí,
Look, Fernando, indeed, here's the amount. This infographic shows the number of kilos of rare earth elements needed to build, in the first case, an F-35 fighter jet, in the second, a Burke-class destroyer, and in the third, a Virginia-class submarine. 418 kilos in the first case, and below are the chemical elements from the periodic table of rare earths.
Pero fijaros, estos elementos, claro, samario, praseodimio, neodimio, es decir,
Samarium, praseodimium, neodymium. In other words, it's not just about quantity, it's about quality. You're saying without these, things don't work, because these are what make, for example, magnets, which are essential in all kinds of modern technologies, impossible to manufacture without these kinds of components. They make it so that very advanced technological systems can't be produced. Take the screen, a cell phone. A cell phone, just to give an idea. The phone we all carry in our pockets contains roughly 40 strategic elements, of which at least half are rare earths.
De los cuales la mitad por lo menos son tierras raras.
For the F-35 fighter jet, according to this infographic, rare earth elements are needed for guided missiles, the lasers used to identify targets, targeting systems, and engines. In the case of the destroyer, they are used for engines, propulsion, missile guidance systems, and advanced radar systems. And in the case of submarines, something also interesting, Tomahawk missiles require rare earths, as do radar systems and propulsion engines. 70% of these minerals come from imports. And, if I remember correctly, China's processing capacity is even greater than its possession of natural resources. It not only holds the absolute majority of the resources, around 70%, but also controls 90% of the processing. Therefore, even resources brought in from other countries must necessarily go through China.
And let's not forget that right now we're in the middle of a crisis, because once again Trump, with the things he does, has raised tariffs against China to 100%, and the Chinese have responded by tightening control even further over the sale of rare earths to Americans. So we are indeed in the middle of a crisis. In this whole setup we've been describing, it sounds like a soap opera, but anyway, in this setup we've been describing, the foreign minister's visit to India takes place, India's rapprochement with the Taliban happens, and on top of that, tensions begin to rise in the border areas in the tribal regions with the Pakistani Taliban.
Con los talibanes pakistaníes. El ejército manda
The army sends troops. Army troops die in clashes with tribal leaders and Pakistani Taliban. Things escalate further and they start crossing the border. From that point on, the Taliban face off against Pakistani border troops, and the situation keeps escalating. Note, Pakistani planes, yesterday and the day before, have been bombing Kabul, for example. In other words, we're not talking about something limited to a border. No, in fact, they've attacked the entire region stretching from Kandahar, the cradle, so to speak, of the Pashtuns and the Taliban, to Jalalabad.
That is to say, they are here. Footage from the 245th Wing of the Pakistan Frontier Corps, under the command of Commander Katak, successfully taking and capturing 4 Afghan border posts near Angorada in the South Waziristan sector. Footage released by the Pakistanis, among many others.
Among many others. So as I was saying, the government's excuse keeps escalating. Well, an excuse that's actually true, but still, namely that the leaders of the Pakistani Taliban are in Afghanistan, that they take refuge there, and that this allows them to carry out attacks. And that's the excuse for launching these strikes that have been escalating up to now. Yesterday, the Taliban proposed a ceasefire, but the Pakistanis said no. In fact, yesterday and today, you could already see columns of Taliban military vehicles, American vehicles, by the way, and not because they were sold to the Taliban, but because of the huge number of vehicles the Americans left behind. In fact, there are some rather curious scenes. A convoy of Taliban soldiers in American Humvees, dozens of them, because those are the ones that were left there.
These images here, dear Fernando, show Taliban forces advancing toward the border.
You look at it and say, what are the Americans doing? No, those are Humvees, an enormous amount of weaponry the Americans left there. Well, they even left aircraft. They have American helicopters and planes. An absolute disaster, that. Well, there we have the Taliban heading toward the border areas, already preparing for ground clashes with the Pakistanis. This has kept escalating. The situation right now is very serious, with a total resurgence of the... More images here as well of Taliban forces, these are from today, I think, moving toward the conflict zones. And right now there's a lot of concern. Why? Because if what is being attempted is the overthrow of the Taliban government, the alternative to the Taliban is not something like a democratic government, supportive of human rights, and especially women's rights. No, they're even worse. The alternative would be what the United States is betting on, none other than Al-Qaeda, that is the Islamic State in Afghanistan, the Islamic State in Khorasan. Khorasan is a province in northern Afghanistan. But anyway, that's the alternative. Those are the ones they wanted to put in power. The beheaders from Syria, the Islamic State version. The beheaders from Syria are Al-Qaeda, more or less the same thing. That is to say, the beheaders from Syria as well, who spread out to many places including Afghanistan, are the ones from the Islamic State. This is the bet the Americans have made, the one the Pakistanis seem to have chosen. Hence these military operations that aim to bring down the Taliban government. The Taliban are supported by India, Russia, and China, who have no interest in seeing major chaos erupt here. They want stability. The escalation continues. Before we started the program, it was still ongoing. The Taliban had requested a truce and the Pakistanis had said no. We'll see.
And more images. These are the attacks with Pakistan's F-16 aircraft against Taliban positions, Afghan positions. We've shown this before, Fernando. The Pakistani armed forces display substantial, remarkable power, incomparably superior to that of Afghanistan, naturally. Right?
In fact, we already saw the success they had with Chinese weaponry, because they combine Chinese arms with what they still have and with some things the Americans sometimes sell them under the table. In fact, what a coincidence. One of the things they've agreed on, and already have, is the sale of air-to-air and air-to-ground missiles for the American F-16s that the Pakistanis own. That is now, coincidentally, the Americans have reached agreements to quickly supply more missiles to the Pakistanis for their F-16s. And they've already closed a deal to deliver more advanced missiles to them for, I can't remember now, 2030, 2029, around that time. I mean, a realignment across the board. Pakistan sides with the Americans after seeing that the Indians, following the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit of heads of state and government, in that move by India toward China, saw that rapprochement, and the Pakistanis said, uh-oh, I don't trust the Chinese anymore, because these good relations between India and China don't suit me. That is to say, a political earthquake, a tectonic shift of massive proportions right now, with a change in alliances that's making it impossible to predict how things will evolve. But tremendous, truly tremendous. That is, with the Indians now being favored by the Chinese. In fact, they had a rare earth embargo on India, and as a gesture of goodwill, they made it so that the lighter rare earths were no longer under embargo. And now they're negotiating with the Indians about the possibility of providing them with the heavier rare earths. In other words, a complete realignment in which a Russia-China-India bloc is forming, and Pakistan, of course, since it has to be on the opposite side, is siding with the Americans.
Rusia, China, India, y Pakistán, evidentemente, como tiene que estar en el lado contrario, se va con los norteamericanos.
Now, Fernando, a realignment in line with the BRICS, because until now the historic enmity, if not enmity, at least rivalry, between China and India, despite the BRICS, determined the closeness between China and Pakistan. Pakistan, a BRICS candidate, but still without direct participation. However, these alliances in some way position the countries. They place them on the BRICS side and the non-BRICS side, or in other words, the Western US Atlanticist side. China and India united, and on the other side, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the United States.
Indeed, with the majority of the global South supporting
Pakistan,
where China, Russia, and India, of course, have a huge interest in making it a stable place. In other words, that there are no wars, that it becomes an orderly place. They are already investing in Afghanistan because, in addition, it is a country that, from a geological and mining standpoint, is very underexploited, but it has many deposits of many resources, a lot of wealth, and everyone wants to get their hands on it. Pakistan has rare earths, by the way. That is to say, control of all that wealth by Pakistan would mean a shift toward the Americans. That is to say, and this is very important because they have gas, they have oil, they have rare earths, they have copper, they have... The copper part is very important. That is to say, and they know it. In Latin America, they know perfectly well how important copper is in the case of Chile. I mean, there was a coup d'etat precisely over the control of copper. Not only, but fundamentally over the control of copper, which is key for any electrical system worldwide. Without copper, there is no electricity. That's why it can be transmitted through copper wires and cables. That is to say, it has a lot going on. It has agreements with the Chinese. The only long-distance train that arrives, recently built, comes from China and enters directly through northern Afghanistan. There's a key interest there. Let's not forget the meeting that also took place this weekend between Russia and the Central Asian countries, with a statement from Minister Lavrov saying that Afghanistan must be respected, that they oppose interference by other states in Afghanistan, because we're talking about something that could destabilize all of Central Asia, and from there all of China, all of Russia, and India. And we're talking about the fact that all of these, China, Russia, India, and Pakistan, are nuclear powers. From there, we've got a real mess on our hands, and it's also affecting Iran. This is a map I used a few shows ago, but it can serve as a general guide to the chaos we're dealing with. Look, it said here, ultimately, all the conflicts led by the Anglos, and especially by the United States, have China as their final target. What happens is that the strategies, as we've discussed before, are different. The Democrat strategy, Biden's strategy, was we take down the Russians, and from there we leave the Chinese isolated. And Trump's strategy is, we take out the Iranians, and from there we've got the Chinese and their Silk Road to the south in ruins. NATO keeps making moves. NATO, the Europeans, and the United States. And here we have, as he was pointing out, look, that is, countries in red, which are countries where there have been border wars. The case of Pakistan and India, I mean recently. The case of Cambodia and Thailand, Southeast Asia, crucial. The case, for example, of Azerbaijan and Armenia. Here we also have color revolutions. Georgia, we talked about it a few weeks ago. Kazakhstan, where there was one in 2022, and then another one later. Uzbekistan failed in this case, just like in Georgia. Let's not forget South Korea, where a president attempted a self-coup that failed, but whose intention was to militarize the country and confront North Korea, sponsored by the Americans, of course. Then we have countries that have been in civil wars for some time, like Myanmar or Syria, which is still ongoing, let's not forget. And then here I also pointed out countries with wars between states. Iran with Israel, Ukraine against Russia. I mentioned here the case of Poland, which is what this map is for, because Poland dealt a tremendous blow to the Chinese when it closed the most important overland Silk Road route that China currently has, which passes through Poland. They later had to reopen it, but from that point on the Chinese no longer trusted the Poles, and there have been many tensions. I also pointed out other places where there have been demonstrations with attempts at color revolutions, such as Indonesia or the Philippines. The successful color revolution in Nepal greatly upset both the Chinese and the Indians. There was also the color revolution in Bangladesh, which brought to power a government that, unlike the previous one, favorable to India and China, is favorable to the United States. All of this is in constant motion. And Afghanistan, which at that time, look, I used as an example of Western pressure, well, it's no longer pressure, it's directly we're going after the Taliban. Because let's not forget, that struck me at the time, and I said, why did he say that? Remember, in September, when those first statements came out, Trump blurted out, since he's such a loudmouth, we want the Bagram base, a military base, the main air base the Afghans had, roughly north of Kabul. Later it became a U.S. base, and now it's in the hands of the Taliban, because they were already thinking about that regime change in Afghanistan, for one aligned with Pakistan, which in turn was shifting toward the United States, and therefore toward a U.S.-friendly regime. That is to say, a new implication, a new interference by the United States to destabilize the entire region, fundamentally affecting India, which was punished for refusing to accept or even negotiate the American tariffs imposed because of its gas and oil trade with Russia, to which the Indians said no, and for maintaining an independent foreign policy. That forced China to prompt Narendra Modi's shift, leading him to visit China and align with the Chinese and Russian positions within the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. From there, all these events were set in motion, turning the entire region upside down. And we'll see, this is only the beginning, how all this evolves, because as I said, since Friday, Saturday, and today, Sunday, clashes continue along the border, with bombings from one side and it seems also from the other. Because the Taliban have an air force, it's not very strong, but still it's American. And this had tremendous consequences, as I said, for all the major actors involved here, on one side or the other.
Yes, if we look at the map, Fernando, the design of the rimland there is truly perfect, the best possible text.
Textbook example. But of course, first the British and then the Americans have internalized the rimland doctrine as if it were the Holy Bible. That is, for them this is, well, you just can't step outside that framework. If you do, it doesn't work. You have to do this. And well, that's what they're doing. That is, in that attempt, let's not forget that the United States, even though they already know they can't invade countries because they fail, continues with that attempt to create chaos. Let's also not forget that we're in an economy that's already fractured and will keep fracturing even more. There is a regionalization of the economy. Poverty hasn't ended, and it's only going to become more pronounced. This doesn't mean that international trade will disappear. No, it will continue, but on a smaller scale and with a restructuring of all supply chains. The idea of having your supply chain spread all over the world to manufacture your iPhones, for example, like Apple does, is over. Because there will be areas where you won't be able to access either the resources or what they produce. No, that's over. Hence the importance of Southeast Asia, which is essential for China and also for Russia. That is the ASEAN countries. And the importance of Europe in this case is crucial for the United States, of which we are vassals. That's why they are using Europe to confront Russia and China in different ways. And that's why we are now also seeing destabilization in Southeast Asia and the countries of South Asia, and continuing to short-circuit China's overland silk roads. Iran is key. That's why, and not just for that reason. That's why the Americans want to put an end to the Ayatollah's regime in Iran. It has nothing to do with democracy or human rights or any of that. It has to do with breaking up that unbeatable triangle, which in Asia, as Brzezinski himself said, is Russia, China, and Iran. If these three are allied, they control Asia. So there's Mr. Trump trying to drive a wedge through the war in Iraq, a proxy war between Israel and Iran, and on the other hand, destabilizing Afghanistan in order to also destabilize Central Asia, which is key for China and Russia.
And now, Fernando, in that triangle, besides Russia, China, and Iran, India, Russia, China, Iran, and India, now the third largest economy in the world, something that wasn't yet foreseen back then in Brzezinski's writings.
The mess we've got going on, and one we'll have to talk about at length in the coming months, because this isn't going to end here.
By the way, Fernando, here are some definitions of Modi, of Narendra Modi, the Indian president, as context for understanding or to accompany, in a more educational way, Fernando's analysis. What is truly India's shift? And why does this shift cause panic in the United States? These are Narendra Modi's words about the UN, in this case. Attention.
Long pending reforms would be realized, that their voices would finally be heard, but that hope has turned into disappointment. It is time for us to work together to give the Global South its rightful seat at the right table.
There's a fantastic video out there of a diplomat. Let me see if I can remember.
Now, Fernando, patience, dear Fernando. By the way, these videos are courtesy of the channel El Ojo, with excellent translations of essential materials for analysis.
A very interesting guy. He has a book published and translated into Spanish.
Both the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and the current Indian Minister of Foreign Affairs, whose name slips my mind right now, are both extremely well prepared and hold very interesting positions. Pay attention to this gentleman's words.
To India. I mean, the British should be gracious about it, right? They got to rule India for 200 years, so the least they can do is repay back.
This is great. Trolling is great. I mean, let's tell it now.
The argument is crystal clear and well-founded. Why do declining powers like France and the United Kingdom determine the fate of the world, while an emerging power, a giant like India, has no participation whatsoever? Brazil should naturally take part as well, but first and foremost India, simply by the right of being a rising giant and not a decrepit power in decline like the United Kingdom or France, right?
Of course, and besides, the argument that no, it's because here we have the nuclear powers, doesn't work with India, because India is a nuclear power. So that argument just doesn't hold. Look, the rise of Asia is unstoppable. and we may like it more or less, just as the decline of Europe is unstoppable. I mean, these are historical periods, and the more, let's say, clear-sighted people already see this, like Go Keng Sui, who has a book that talks precisely about that, about the rise of Asia and how it's unstoppable. And as I said, people in Singapore are generally very well prepared, the diplomats, the minister, and so on. And they've also known how to navigate turbulent waters and maneuver with the Chinese. Because Singapore is a very interesting state, as you know, since most of its population is Chinese. It's a city-state. The second largest group would be Malays, and the third, Indians. Yes. And one thing I forgot. When Modi says this, he's pointing to something that's increasingly being rumored and seems to be heading in that direction. That is, organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS could start creating a kind of United Nations 2.0 that, at a certain point, would say, since you don't let us participate as we should, as part of the Global South, in the setup you've got going at the United Nations, we'll create our own sort of United Nations 2.0, where everyone will be included except the collective West.
Narendra Modi talks about these things.
It is a light of hope, especially for the countries of the Global South. India wants to improve its digital cooperation and its participation in the world through its technological innovations. And that's why, with its experience and its open source platform, the face of this message was a very clear program.
This is very important.
India was already one of the pioneering countries, let's not forget, in the production of generic medicines without authorization from pharmaceutical companies. They said, look, forget it. I don't need people to die.
And India, by the way, during the pandemic, when the vaccine business began, right, put forward the proposal to universalize vaccine patents for universal and free distribution. And of course, this was rejected by the major Western powers, representatives of multinational laboratories. Over here, Fernando, speaking of all this, but on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, there's Lula.
Because we are going to continue strengthening our relationship with China. I can tell you that I consider myself a friend of President Xi Jinping, and I am certain that he considers himself a friend of Brazil, because we treat each other as two important countries of the Global South, and we do not accept anyone sticking their finger in our nose.
Well, clear enough, right? Yes, impossible. About how a different world order is taking shape, still in the process of being configured, of course. And that's why we have Mr. Trump and the United States in general in panic mode, doing what they do best, throwing the world into chaos, wrecking the international economy, and so on and so on and so on. That's what they're doing. But anyway, I think it's unstoppable. This emerging international order is unstoppable. The problem is the cost. That is, the declining empire is going to make the world as a whole pay a tremendous price. He's already doing it, huh? But well, the price is going to be even higher because he's not going to stop fighting until the end. I mean, these people, because of their idea of manifest destiny and their belief that they are like the Israelis, a chosen people, are going to go all the way. So they're going to die killing. And since they're going to die killing, first, the general disaster they're going to cause will be historic. And second, the great fear is that these lunatics could drag us into a nuclear war. And that's the great fear everyone has.
Over here, on the other hand, Fernando, by the way, demolishes. Please remember to help us out with a thumbs up by subscribing to the channel and with memberships. And by the way, join us as well on our English channel, okay? It has the same name as our channel, just in English. The link is below. And on our channel's homepage, of course, you'll also find the link to the English channel and to our sister channel, MP Geopolitics, featuring Fernando Moragón's show every Friday.
Man, just seeing me speak English makes it worth it.
That is, through the geopolitical institution. Yes, help us. The hardest thing for artificial intelligence, basically, is to determine when Fernando is speaking and when I am, because of Fernando's interruptions. I have a job, Fernando, every morning, helping with the AI transcriptions, and it's always the same problem. Which part is yours and which part is mine in the conversations? But I wanted to present, at the end, dear Fernando, the words, since we presented the words of Narendra Modi, of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, the words of the leader of the West, the leader of the free world, the leader of democracy. Who, my dear Fernando? Donald Trump, the next Nobel Prize winner? No. The leader of democracy? No. The real leader. The leader above Trump, dear Fernando.
No irony, Kay.
Attention. The most important leader of the free world is Mr. Larry Fink. Oh, well, of course not. The CEO, the president of BlackRock, the most important investment fund in the world, basically the puppeteer behind the puppets, with the puppets being the US president or the US presidents, the European presidents, and the other presidents of the world, with few exceptions, with the will and power to set limits on the might of Wall Street, and above all, on the most concentrated sectors of Wall Street.
Strong support for Israel. In fact, I don't remember if he's Jewish. I think he is, but I'm not sure. So full support for the Jewish lobby. The financier and I believe vice president of Davos, the World Economic Forum. In other words, a convinced globalist. But since what really matters is interest, he already announced in March 2022 that globalization would be over. On their website, on BlackRock's website. BlackRock is extremely important because it's estimated to manage about $10 trillion. That's outrageous. More than the budgets of any normal country. And at the same time, it has a special relationship with the second one. The second major investment fund is Vanguard. The thing is, Vanguard owns BlackRock, and BlackRock owns Vanguard, so we're basically talking about the same thing. The two major investment funds control all the big industries. So when we see Mark Zuckerberg, for example, and say, he's the boss, the one in charge of Meta, of Facebook, no, they let him do things and he's the face. But the one who holds the majority stake in Facebook or Meta is this entity, BlackRock.
Here are his words, Fernando, about BlackRock's relationship with the states.
Largest retirement manager, non-Japanese, in Japan. You know, we're the largest retirement manager in the UK, including the domestics. And I do go out of my way when there's somebody who's new in their role, a new prime minister. I will spend time. Generally, what I try to do is spend time before they win, and meet the candidates. So, whether it's in Mexico, spending time with Claudia before she won.
This is what you call having insider information. But oh well.
Clearer than this. Basically, through control of pensions, control of the states, and him directly, not just with the confession of sometimes I overstep literally, sometimes I directly coerce when they don't want what I want, but generally through soft power. Before someone is elected, I sponsor them, I establish contact, and afterward they follow my orders. And there he mentioned Claudia Sheinbaum, but he also mentioned Keir Starmer. And in short, all the presidents of the world.
With all his nerve. That is what many of us have been saying for a long time. You can vote for whoever you want. It doesn't matter, because the one in charge is this man. It doesn't matter if people in the United Kingdom vote for Labour or the Conservatives. It doesn't matter if in Spain they vote for the PP or the PSOE. It doesn't matter who they vote for, because this man is going to be talking to all the candidates. He said it himself. I talk to all the candidates, and I don't care who gets elected, because they're all going to do what I want. In other words, democracy is a big lie.
By the way, this is how these investment funds have grown and become involved in the politics of countries all over the world. That's mainly how they started. Today, of course, they participate in every sector of the economy. Therefore, their influence and presence can be seen everywhere. But the beginning of the expansion of these funds was tied to the management of pension funds within the framework of the privatization of pension and retirement systems on a global scale. Pay-as-you-go systems, right? Systems managed by the state with a principle of intergenerational solidarity.
Con un principio de solidaridad intergeneracional, básicamente los trabajadores de hoy realizan.
Basically, today's workers make contributions to support yesterday's workers, the retired ones. The active workers sustain the retirees, and in the future, naturally, the situation reverses. The active become retirees, and the new workers finance the old ones. In the 1990s, driven by the United States within the framework of the Washington Consensus, and the imposition of neoliberalism on a global scale after the fall of the Soviet Union, the trend toward the privatization of pension systems began. What's the idea? That each worker generates their own savings, which would represent their future retirement. Beyond the end of solidarity within this principle, beyond the great business behind all this, it led to pension fund managers on a global scale suddenly wielding enormous power, no longer only in the economic sphere, due to their management of this immense sum of money, basically the savings of all the world's workers, but also because of their ability to blackmail states. Because, if one of these funds were to decide tomorrow that it will not make the retirement or pension payments owed to workers who have saved their entire lives, a civil war would immediately begin in each of these countries. Immediately, because of the expropriation of people's savings for their old age. Well, this clearly represents a form of suicide, in a way, or self-destruction of the states, handing over workers' savings, pensions, and retirements to private entities, so that from then on, the states themselves would appear as victims, as clowns, as subordinate elements to the pension administrators, to the fund managers. These, for example, BlackRock. I wanted to emphasize this point here, Fernando, because they often present the trends of capitalism as if they were given, natural things. No, not at all. No. States and political and economic leaderships actively participate in this destruction of state sovereignty and workers' rights. The same goes for other issues, such as, for example, digitalization, which is conceived as something natural, given in itself. No, states generate the digitalization of life, and then they end up being subject to platforms in areas as basic as communication, democracy, and even at times the provision of basic services. Without a cell phone or a platform, citizens now simply lack access to those things. I just wanted to wrap this up after this gentleman's words. This is one of the owners of the ball, of the dreams, of the little setup, as Fernando would call it. This is one of the owners of the world, together, of course, with the patriarchs of Silicon Valley, but also with the patriarchs of Wall Street. This one, even more so, is one of the owners of the world. And all of that, with our money, the money from our pensions. Fernando, my friend, as always, it's been a pleasure talking. The closing is in your hands, or on your lips. Whatever you prefer to wrap up this conversation.
Nada, pues simplemente decir que como estamos viendo.
Well, just to say that, as we can see, there is a trend on one hand of destructive decline, which is what the North American empire and its European allies, Japan and so on, are showing in open war, in open hybrid war with the rest of the world. And we're seeing it, we've been discussing it from Gaza through Afghanistan, India, China, Russia. That is to say, we have to be aware of this, that we are, I call it a world war, or a hybrid world war, if you prefer, but we must be clear about it. And we are also heading toward a situation in which the general trend in the medium term is the impoverishment of the world. Some more, some less. Why? Because we have an underlying problem, which is also the reason why the North American empire fights with some and with others. The control of energy resources and strategic minerals. Because without energy, we're going nowhere. And it turns out that in addition to being concentrated, like strategic minerals in China's case, oil and gas in Asia, the Middle East, and so on, there's a problem. And that is something that, for example, the International Energy Agency already told us, an organization that tends to be very optimistic, to put it mildly, and they've had to acknowledge it. There are extraction problems, meaning there are scarcity problems, and we're going to notice those shortages of oil and gas more and more. So, I have to say it, I'm sorry, the private car is something that will disappear, because there won't be enough capacity, not even with electric cars, since the energy needed to sustain them, whether electric, gasoline, diesel, etc., won't be allowed. We're heading toward a world of scarcity. Scarcity means, let this be recorded. That is to say, it's not just that the limited energy we'll have available for any human activity will be distributed. It's that inequality will grow, and this gentleman from BlackRock will have all the energy he wants, taking it away from the rest of the world. Just to give a clear example, and this is what we need to keep in mind, if we don't react, what we'll have is a world of energy scarcity, of increasingly scarce strategic minerals, where the distribution of wealth will be even more unequal, and these people will hoard all that energy for their own purposes, for their own use. And they'll do it in two ways. Generating totalitarian states, dictatorships, if you will, and making us dumber. That's why the issue of education is so serious. That's why people are trained only in technical matters and not given a global perspective. That's why real philosophy isn't taught in schools, because they want people who are dumbed down, who don't think. Right now, people working in artificial intelligence are already determining, and there are studies, that being in front of AI, using it for long periods of time, or even without AI, using your phone too much, is causing people to lose cognitive abilities.
La pérdida de capacidades cognitivas en las personas. Seremos completamente idiotas con la inteligencia artificial.
We'll become completely idiotic with artificial intelligence, because it will do everything for us, and we won't have to think to do anything. Completely idiotic. And this is already a debate among artificial intelligence experts, the loss of cognitive abilities, both in terms of knowledge and applied knowledge. Because we'll already have someone who will do it for us, the artificial intelligence. In other words, we'll lose our personal sovereignty in the hands of these people. Of course, it will end up in the hands of these people, the people at Palantir, this man. That's where we're headed. It's in our hands to try to stop it or not. But of course, if we maintain a passive attitude, as we Europeans do, we're finished.
Fernando, querido, un lujo como siempre la conversación.
Fernando, my dear, as always, it's a pleasure talking with you. Remember, demolishers, help us out with a thumbs up to spread our talks, which are always censored by the platform through demonetization, or simply by cutting off their reach. So, click share, click subscribe, click the thumbs up. If you'd like to support us through memberships or PayPal, you're more than welcome. You can also follow us on our social media, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Lastly, A big thank you today to Beatriz Pulido, who helped me with some advice on a certain matter. Thank you very much, Beatriz, for your input. That said, to all the demolishers, a big kiss, and see you in our next broadcast on our sister channel, MP Geopolitics. Santiago Martinez has already started. Everyone head over there right now.
Santiago Martínez, todo el mundo para allá. Todo el mundo ya para allá.
Hug, hug, Fernando. Bye-bye.
Yeah.